Hello everyone, today I will be explaining and discussing the three different kinds of potentials found within a neuron's membrane. So we have resting membrane potential, local potential, and action potential. So the very first one would be resting membrane potential. This is defined as the value of the electric potential of the plasma membrane when it is at rest and ready to send a signal. The value is considered negative 70 millivolts. And it's also described as being polarized. So polarized just basically means that the intracellular fluid is going to be negative 70 millivolts. This is caused by sodium ions and potassium ions found within the ECF and the ICF respectively. The sodium ions are positively charged as well as the potassium ions. However, there are also negatively charged proteins in the ICF, which causes it to be slightly negative on the outside. There are within the membranes protein pumps, sodium and potassium protein pumps that actively pump sodium and potassium into and out of the membrane. These are active at all times, and it allows them to keep the membrane in a polarized state. So local potential occurs when there is a stimulation of the dendrites through like a trigger of some sort, and the sodium will diffuse into the intracellular fluid. So this is what it looks like. A stimulation will occur, and it will cause the sodium the sodium channels to open. There's a sudden change of the more positive sodium ions into the membrane. So it causes the membrane to depolarize slightly, just meaning the charge that goes up a little bit. It's around 60 millivolts or so. There are three characteristics of local potential. The first one is that is graded. So it can vary in magnitude and strength depending on the original stimulus. If it is more stimulated, more of these sodium channels will open and more sodium will enter into the ICF, which will cause greater depolarization. It is also considered decremental. So the electrical current as it travels through the neuron will get weaker the farther from the original stimulus it gets. Local potential is also considered reversible. So if the original stimulus ceases, so will the current, and the intracellular fluid will return to its original polarized state of negative 70 millivolts. Due to the sodium channels closing and the pumps returning back the sodium ions back into the ECF. So then once that stimulus stops, then we just come back into resting membrane potential, which is how it originally was. Now, if the local potential reaches the axon hillock, the axon hillock has many more sodium and potassium channels than the soma or the dendrites do. So when this occurs, it causes, when the local potential reaches the axon hillock region, it causes depolarization there. If that local potential is strong enough, it will depolarize this region enough to around negative 55 millivolts, which is the threshold for action potential to begin. So in this drawing, we can see at the very top here, there are many more sodium and potassium ion channels than originally found in dendrites or somas. When this local potential reaches this area, if the local potential is strong enough, it will cause the charge to reach, or it would depolarize the membrane enough to negative 55 millivolts. When this threshold occurs at negative 55, all of the sodium channels will open, and it will cause all of the sodium from the ECF to diffuse into the ICF. This is when rapid depolarization occurs, and the electric potential of the ICF will go from negative 55 to 0 millivolts all the way up to negative 35, which can be found down here. As we can see, all of the sodium from outside is now in the ICF, and with all of the potassium and the sodium ions being inside, this is why the charge reaches positive 35 millivolts. It causes a domino effect down the axon, so the charge goes all the way here down the axon continuously. At 35 millivolts, the sodium channels will close and potassium channels will open, allowing potassium ions to diffuse into the ECF. So this will look a little bit more like this. So as we can see, the sodium ions are still within the ICF, but now sodium gates are closed and potassium gates open to allow potassium ions out into the ECF. This is done in an attempt to repolarize the membrane or shift it back to its original negative 70 millivolts. The electric potential will overcorrect at first to around negative 75 millivolts because there's so many positive ions going out, and we still have those negative proteins in there. However, it will then return to its original resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. So then we just return back to this original state. When this negative 70 millivolts is reached, then potassium gates will close, and the regular potassium and sodium pumps will take over and return the ions to their original positions. So at this point, just as before, the sodium channels and the potassium channels are closed, and the pumps that actively and continuously work will return the ions back into their original position. Just to show you a little bit of a different way of looking at this, here is a graph I have created. So for action potential right at the top here, we start at negative 70. As we get that local potential to depolarize the membrane, the action potential event occurs at negative 55, and we see a rapid depolarization of the membrane all the way up to 35 millivolts. When this 35 millivolts is reached, sodium channels close and potassium channels open, causing a rapid repolarization of the membrane. As we can see down here, it goes slightly beneath negative 70 millivolts, around to 75, and then we return to that original negative 70 millivolts, or the resting membrane potential. This is when the sodium channels and the potassium channels are both closed, and then the sodium and potassium ion pumps take over. There are three characteristics of action potential. The very first one is it follows the all or none law. So if the local potential that reaches the axon hillock is strong enough to trigger action potential at that negative 55 millivolts threshold, then the action potential will occur at full strength throughout the length of the axon. If it does not cause the action potential, so it does not reach that negative 55, then no action potential will occur. Action potential is also considered non-decremental. So the action potential will remain full strength down the entire length of the axon, regardless of how far away it gets from the original stimulus. So as we discussed in local potential, that current will get weaker and weaker the farther from the original stimulus it gets. This does not occur in action potential. And finally, action potential is irreversible. So once it starts, it cannot be stopped. Hope this video helped.